It's the best way I've ever heard to describe the project. Thank you for that. Good lead in. So today we're going to be talking about the level and extent of human waste-related disturbance on 2 beaches in Olympic National Park. Next slide, please. I guess before I get started, I want to just say that this was a very large project that took multiple years to do and lots of collaboration with the Quileute Tribe and with multiple labs across Oregon State University. And I'm going to condense it into a very small presentation, but there's a lot of details and nuance we're going to lose here. But some background information and site information about this project. We're all very aware, I'm sure, that there's pretty high levels of outdoor recreation occurring in Olympic National Park. In 2021, when we did our field season, there was 2.7 million visitors to the park at large. And for many years now, human waste disposal issues really throughout the Olympic Peninsula have been prolific on the beaches. And we were focusing on the treaty lands of the Quileute Tribe to understand the human waste disposal issues on 2nd and 3rd beaches specifically. Now, each of these beaches has one pit toilet on it that outdoor recreationists can use if they choose to. But sometimes, depending on where you're at on the beach, it can be hard to get back up there to use that specific pit toilet. But the main concern for this project was that the Quileute Tribe had some concerns about how human waste in their treaty areas may be contributing to environmental contamination and potentially pose human health issues. So that's kind of the target of this study. Next slide, please. So we wanted to look at this at different levels and try to understand the full scope of the problem as much as we could do. So the first question that we asked was, what relationship exists between outdoor recreationists, human fecal matter, and fecal indicator bacteria in this study system? And then are humans the source of bacterial contamination found on the beaches? And does the contamination pose human health issues? And that's a really important question because bacteria can originate from lots of different types of animals. So understanding the source of any bacteria that we found is important. And then also asking, well, how serious can this bacteria be for human health was also very important for the study. Next slide, please. We had a lot of objectives. Like I said, this was a huge project. Our first objective was to understand visitor use patterns pertaining to camping and visitor use behaviors pertaining to fecal matter site locations. So where are these people camping when they're out on these beaches, and where are they depositing their fecal matter when they're not using the pit toilets? So we collected camping permit data, and then we did a bunch of spatial mapping and spatial statistics of the campsites and the fecal matter locations. And we analyzed those through multiple different means, including ANOVA testing. Next slide. Our second objective was to understand the locations and the time-related or the temporal patterns of E. coli and total coliforms in sand and water samples. So we're looking more at like the ecological impacts of what's happening down at the bacterial levels. So we went in for multiple months and we did weekly sand sampling and marine water sampling on both beaches. And then we brought all of those samples back and did different cellular methods to isolate the bacteria that we found and to quantify E. coli and total coliforms specifically. And those two groups of bacteria originate from the intestines and gastrointestinal tracts of mammals and some birds. So that's why we focused on these two types. Next slide, please. Our next objective was to understand the source of E. coli isolates and to determine the differences between human prevalence in sample types and by site locations. So we needed to know, where did the E. coli come from? What type of animal? Is it from humans? And then what's going on in the differences between water and sand samples with what we're finding and between the two beaches. And then our last objective was to characterize the genotypic, which is really like the genetic antibiotic resistance, or the phenotypic, and the phenotypic antibiotic resistance, where we're actually showing like active antibiotic resistance. So we were characterizing these two things to understand the antibiotic resistant profiles of E. coli isolates and to determine the differences between prevalence and sample types and site locations. The genotypic and phenotypic differences are basically that you can a bacteria can be genetically coded to have antibiotic resistance, but it might not be active resistance, which would be in the phenotypic. So we're looking at both of those on different scales. So our methods that we did to understand this was we used Vitek2 testing to understand the phenotypic or the active resistance to antibiotics. And then we did PCR assays to understand the genotypic antibiotic resistance. And we also did chi-square tests. Next slide, please. So very generalized results here. We found that visitor use was the highest during the summer use season, which makes sense. And fecal matter followed a similar pattern, which also makes sense because when we have lots of humans out there, we're probably going to see more fecal matter. And then we also saw that campsites and fecal matter were generally found closer to trailheads than further out along the beaches. And so on these kernel density maps on the right, the top two are second and third beach respectively, where we're looking at the kernel densities of campsites, and you can see the high congregation of campsites near the trailheads in both of them. It's a little bit more spread out in the second figure, where you can see on third beach, we have different levels of density there. For fecal matter, there was a pretty big high density area near Second Beach Trail, and it was actually located a little bit inward in the forest. And on Third Beach, you can see a similar pattern to the campsites with our densities. Next slide, please. We also looked at hotspot locations. We were looking at statistically significant disordered GI hotspots. And our hotspot locations of E. coli and total coliforms from sand and soils really were in different patterns in the beaches. And we didn't find any hotspots at all in water samples, which makes sense because water is constantly moving in and out and turning around in the ocean, moving all over the beach at any given time. We also found higher CFUs, which are colony forming units. That's the metric that we talk about when we're dealing with bacteria. So we found those were generally located in close proximity to fecal matter, which makes sense, right? Human fecal matter has bacteria, so our higher colony forming units that we found were located in proximity to the fecal matter. Our results also have a lot of management implications for ecological impacts for the visitor use experience. Like, what does it feel like when you're out there and you're seeing fecal matter all over these beaches because people aren't using those pit toilets? And to humans in general, when we're thinking also about the potential health impacts that can happen from being exposed to that type of bacteria. So if you look at these two maps here, you can see our hotspots of our E. coli, and it's actually the same for our total coliforms. Again, we're seeing those in those high density areas where we previously looked on the map on Second Beach. And then on Third Beach, they're kind of spread out in different patterns. And I know you can barely see those at this scale, but or at this resolution. Next slide, please. And we can skip this slide because it's a repeat slide. So when we talk about like the human health aspects, these are some more generalized results from our research. There was a strong presence of human genetic markers, like very strong in our samples, and antibiotic resistant genes and virulence factors. Now, virulence factors are what show us if a specific type of E. coli poses pathogenic issues for human health. So is it going to make you sick, and what type of illnesses might actually happen if you come across this type of bacteria? And the antibiotic resistant genes also help us understand what types of antibiotic resistant bacteria or what types of antibiotic resistance are happening within these bacteria, along with our Vitek2 testing that shows us what's active and what's not active. So the strong presence of all of these variables here from Second and Third Beaches that we found in our study suggests that park visitors really need better education about the risks and the potential impacts of improper human waste disposal. So this is like a public education problem, especially since we've all been taught for years about leave no trace principles to bury fecal matter, in the sand and stuff like that, or in soils. That may not be obviously the best practice in these specific marine systems. So the best practice instead is actually to probably pack that fecal matter out, just like we do at dog parks when we have a dog that uses the restroom. So instead of actually like digging down and digging a cat hole, we're suggesting that outdoor recreationists need to be educated to potentially pack things out, and that policies could also be implemented to change these practices. Because the burial of fecal matter in these beach sands may contribute to the spread of antibiotic resistant genes and pathogenic forms of E. coli that can pose human health risk problems, which is especially important to tribes that are using these areas for subsistence purposes and other cultural purposes as well. You know, we don't want to get into an issue where we have bacteria that's naturalizing in the sand, and it might have antibiotic resistance characteristics that just becomes very detrimental to human health. So Olympic National Park, some of our implications for Olympic National Park are that they should consider developing pack out policies like I talked about, but also provide recreationists with information about where they should dispose of that fecal matter so that we don't see issues where people are just like bagging up their fecal matter, leaving it on the beaches so that the ocean can come in and carry that out. That's a whole different problem that we don't want to see from this. And it can create other ecological and even like wildlife issues if that happens. And then additional considerations for Olympic National Park include developing more waste disposal facilities, but that's tricky because this isn't a wilderness designated area, and the Wilderness Act's guidelines are very specific to what types of facilities can be developed. So again, this comes down to a human behavioral issue that can be changed through proper education and potentially through park policies that change user responsibilities while they're recreating. I think that's it. Next slide, maybe. Okay, we're good.
All right. Well, gosh, thank you. Thank you for taking this issue on. And I appreciate your direct recommendations to park management too. I think that's really always helpful. We do have a couple questions in the chat. I'm going to ask mine first because I'm just so curious how you personally ended up in this line of research. Is this kind of what your lab does, or is this a unusual project for you?
This came from my dissertation research in Dr. Ashley D'Antonio's lab, and we're a group of recreation ecologists. So we are always looking at how recreation activities may be creating impacts in different parks. However, as an Indigenous woman myself, I wanted to take more of an Indigenous lens to this research. So we went up and spoke with the Quileute Tribe, who really was instrumental in directing the focus of this project and talking to us about their concerns and how those concerns weren't really being addressed for years. So this project is for them so that they can understand what was happening. Yeah, I mean, it's fecal matter, it's
That's great. It's great to know you're out there and helping parks deal with this ever increasing issue. Yeah. I'll move on to some of the chat questions. Someone says they stayed at the motel complex on the reservation with good bathrooms, but what about a good toilet facility somewhere for day trippers? I'm not sure you have that one.
That's like, so we were actually out, so on the reservation, that's First Beach, and we were actually out in Olympic National Park managed lands, which are the treaty lands of Quileute Tribe. So,
right.
Yeah, that's a whole different study.
Right.
Sorry.
The next person is curious about people avoiding the pit toilets.
Yeah, so there's two pit toilets. There's one on each beach. One of them is kind of difficult to get to be honest. And you can imagine some of these beaches are very long. So if you're at the very south end of the beach and maybe you're camping down there and you have children or whatever, are they going to be able to walk like a mile or so before they need to use the restroom? Some people can't, right? So the position of them might not be advantageous for some people. Also, sometimes pit toilets are disgusting, right? We all know that. Most of us do who have ever tried to use one. So some of this could be about better management of the pit toilets to make them cleaner and more appetizing, if you will. For people.
Nice word choice. Next question. Has there been any discussion about assessing the E. coli contamination along the rivers in the park? I am amazed by how much waste is left unburied right along the trails on the Hoh River.
So there has been previous research conducted in the park where they're looking specifically at how outdoor recreation and fecal matter that is associated with it may be impacting rivers. I don't remember the specific results from that study, but if you look in the scholarly literature, there is, I think, one paper about it. I'm not familiar with anyone else doing this type of research currently, especially with the waste problem that's really increasing because of outdoor recreation visitor numbers increasing. So that's a good question.
Then Steve Frafkin asks, do you have any idea how your results relate to the pathogenic load in harvested organisms on the beach?
That was initially part of this project, and I'm sure a lot of you remember the big heat wave that we had in 2021 that basically cooked a lot of the shellfish on these beaches, and we went out there and saw it like right after it happened. And so we had to make some ethical decisions out in the field to not do that part of the research because we did want to know if the shellfish were uptaking any of the bacteria and posing an additional human health issue specifically for the tribe. We weren't able to do that because too many of the shellfish died off. However, there is literature that suggests that shellfish do uptake bacteria from the waters because they're filters, right? So the potential is there, but research really still needs to be done. But also, when we think about ethical considerations of populations of organisms that have just had a huge population decline, it might not be the right time to do that. But that's something also for the tribe to think about for their own studies as well.
And there's another question. Do you have plans to develop a tribal consumption advisory? I guess it would.
I don't speak for the Quileute Tribe. I know that the Quileute Tribe is working, though, at many different scales to address this problem. And I know that there's other tribes in the Olympic Peninsula that are concerned about similar things going on in their areas. I don't have any of those plans myself, but if there is any type of tribal consumption advisory, if there's any need for that or need for, for research, I'd be happy to help. Yeah.
All right. Well, then there's a handful of other comments, basically talking about the crappiness of the problem and gratitude for your studying it and how important it is. And it will just become increasingly important with time, unfortunately, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yep.
Someone missed what species and the causes of shellfish mortality was. Sorry.
Oh, so we didn't do that study. That wasn't part of it. It was initially part of it, but we didn't. And it wasn't about killing the shellfish, but more about the public implications of consuming shellfish that is contaminated or that could be.
Any more questions out there? Alrighty, well, gosh, yeah, thanks for your work and for a great presentation.